What if I told you that behind the cold stone walls of medieval castles, beyond the clanking armor and holy crosses, people were doing things so shocking, so unthinkable, that even today they would be censored? The Middle Ages weren't just about knights and plagues. It was a world of secret sins, bizarre bedroom rituals, and wild punishments that would make your jaw drop. Let's go back in time, but this time we're lifting the bed covers. The medieval world may seem like a time of strict rules, harsh religion, and moral control, but the truth beneath the surface was often the complete opposite. People desired, people rebelled, and people invented their own ways of exploring sex, even when the church, the law, and society all said don't. Let's start with one of the strangest and most controversial practices ever recorded. 5. The trial of virginity. In some noble marriages, especially among the wealthy or the royals, a bride's virginity had to be proven. And no, not with trust or talk. There were entire ceremonies where a couple's first night was watched, literally. The bed sheets would be checked for blood as evidence of a torn hymen. And sometimes older noble women or even priests were called in to witness the act. If no blood was found, the bride could be shamed or sent back to her father's house. Imagine the pressure of your first night knowing half the court was waiting to inspect your bed afterward. The expectation was that sex would follow a specific, natural order, the man on top, the woman beneath, and no creativity. Anything outside of that, like changing positions or showing too much enjoyment, was considered sinful or even dangerous. But some people didn't follow the rules. 4. The Sinful Positions Guidebooks. During the late Middle Ages, several religious writers, particularly monks, started writing texts warning about sexual positions. Yes, they created whole lists, ranking them from acceptable to damnable. Anything other than the missionary position was considered perverse. Even turning to face your partner during sex could be grounds for confession. One monk wrote that if a man and woman had sex standing up, it could confuse the angels watching from heaven. Another warned that rear entry was a sure path to damnation. And yet, the fact that these texts exist means people were doing it. These weren't fantasies. They were trying to stop what was already happening behind closed doors. Some churches went even further. They gave married couples calendars of when they were allowed to have sex. Sundays, forbidden. Holy days, no way. Fridays, never. And during Lent, absolutely not. That left only a few days a month if you were lucky. Of course, many ignored this, but it shows how tightly religion tried to wrap itself around desire. Still, not all sexual acts were hidden. Some were part of punishment. 3. Public shame, sexual style. In certain towns across medieval Europe, adultery wasn't just a personal sin, it was a public crime. If a man was caught sleeping with another man's wife, both could be paraded through the streets naked, tied together, or forced to wear humiliating costumes that exposed their crime. In German towns, a man found guilty of cheating might be made to ride backward on a donkey holding a chicken between his legs, symbolizing weakness and lust. But it gets worse. In some villages in France and Italy, the couple caught in adultery could be whipped, then tied together in awkward sexual positions and left that way for hours in the town square, with people throwing rotten food or shouting curses. The goal wasn't just punishment, it was shame. Deep, unforgettable shame tied directly to the act itself. But even more shocking than that was what happened in noble courts, where power made everything possible. 2. The Court of Love and Lust. In the courts of certain kings, especially in France and Burgundy, there were strange little games nobles played. Some created mock trials of love, where men and women argued about romantic cases like, was it wrong for a knight to seduce a married lady if he truly loved her? But these weren't innocent debates. These courts were often excuses for flirtation, seduction, and secret affairs. Kings like Charles VI of France were known to hold lavish banquets filled with music, alcohol, and young dancers. Sometimes these ended in masked orgies, where identities were hidden, and even married nobles were free to indulge. Power covered a lot of sins. The line between romance and sex blurred. Chivalry wasn't always about honor. Sometimes it was just a fancy word for seduction. But if all of this seems wild already, nothing comes close to number one. 1. The religious sex cures. You wouldn't expect monks and nuns to talk openly about sex, but some did more than talk. In certain convents, especially in Italy and Spain, there were whispered stories of holy remedies. If a nun was said to be possessed by demons, or even just overcome by hysteria, some priests believed the cure was penetration. Yes, it was called driving out the devil. A priest would perform the act in the name of healing, claiming it was a spiritual service. While this was rare and considered heretical, it shows how twisted ideas about sex, power, and salvation could become in a world ruled by both fear and desire. Some even believed that having sex with a virgin could cure diseases like leprosy or syphilis. Young girls, sometimes as young as 10, were targeted by powerful men desperate for healing. It was cruel, wrong, and justified under the cover of myth. The truth is, the Middle Ages were full of contradictions. While people were told sex was shameful, sinful, and only for reproduction, they were also surrounded by temptations, fantasies, and secret practices that showed the exact opposite. Behind every stone wall was a hidden story. Behind every sermon, a scandal. And behind every rule, someone was breaking it.
While the church preached purity and society pushed restraint, behind the doors of castles, brothels, and monasteries, medieval men and women were experimenting in ways that would make even modern folks blink in disbelief. Some did it in secret, others in plain sight. And the closer we look, the stranger it gets. Let's step into the medieval bedroom, or what passed for one, and see what sex actually looked like. The idea of how to perform sex in the Middle Ages was completely wrapped up in superstition, shame, and bizarre beliefs. First, sex was seen as a necessary evil. It was okay only for making babies. Anything else, pleasure, love, passion, was either ignored or punished. But the human body didn't care what the priest said, so people started to invent their own ways. In peasant homes, there was barely any privacy. Families often lived in one room, animals included. Curtains were rare. So when a couple wanted to have sex, they'd usually wait until nighttime, under a blanket, and do it as quietly as possible. Sometimes even that wasn't private enough, so some invented little hiding spaces behind haystacks, in corners of barns, or even in the forest. Sex was both a risk and a thrill. And what about the act itself? Books and religious sermons often said men must be dominant and women passive. But in reality, many couples broke that rule. In fact, some women, especially among the elite, were known to take control in bed. In old court letters and secret records, there are stories of noblewomen using herbal oils and animal skins to enhance pleasure. Some even wore devices crafted by blacksmiths in secret. This wasn't just forbidden, it was revolutionary. And it wasn't just nobles doing strange things. Brothels and public sex houses. In cities like London, Paris, and Florence, licensed brothels were common. Authorities didn't ban them, they regulated them. Women working there were often forced into the job, but some made a name for themselves as powerful figures, earning money, secrets, and protection. But even more surprising was how open these places were. In Southwark, London, there was a whole street of sex houses near the cathedral. Men could visit after attending Mass. Inside these places, sex wasn't just sex, it was a performance. Rooms had mirrors, silk sheets, and sometimes even costumes. One brothel offered nun fantasies, where women dressed in veils and robes while reciting prayers mid-act. Another advertised wild beast nights, where clients wore animal masks. Some houses even kept manuals for clients, explaining positions and giving tips on pleasure. These were handwritten guides, often passed from man to man, with illustrations that would shock a modern librarian. But these acts didn't always go unpunished. Punishment by device. When people stepped out of line, or even just got caught, medieval justice could be brutal. One of the most terrifying tools used was the chastity belt. While there's debate about how common they were, some real examples survive. These belts were made of iron, locked with keys, and worn by women, sometimes willingly, but often by force. The idea was to keep a woman from having sex, whether for virtue or for ownership. Husbands going off to war sometimes locked their wives in these devices for months. But more painful was the scold's bridle. If a woman was accused of being too outspoken or too lustful, she might be forced to wear a metal mask with a sharp bit inside her mouth. It didn't just silence her, it hurt every time she tried to speak. Other punishments included branding, whipping, and being forced to crawl naked through town while children threw stones, all for sex that didn't follow the rules. But of course, the people with power didn't follow the rules at all. Medieval kings and their sex rooms. We've already talked about noble courts, but kings? They had access to anything and anyone they wanted. In some castles, hidden rooms were built just for sexual pleasure. These weren't bedrooms, they were theaters of desire. King Edward IV of England, for example, was rumored to have a private hall where he invited dancers, musicians, and women from the countryside. These events weren't simply orgies, they were spectacles, with costumes, music, food, and servants trained to disappear. In France, King Charles VII kept a group of young women known as filles de joie, or girls of joy, who were trained to entertain not just the king, but visiting nobles. These women were educated, witty, and chosen for their beauty. Even the church wasn't safe from scandal. The carnal confessions. Some priests used confessionals not to hear sins but to find lovers. In certain towns, priests would ask explicit questions during confession, not to guide the soul, but to satisfy their curiosity or even blackmail the woman later. This led to many forbidden affairs. In some abbeys, records show secret passageways between the nuns' dormitories and the priests' chambers. Love letters were found hidden inside walls. Some nuns became pregnant and were quietly removed or forced to abandon their babies at monasteries. And perhaps the most haunting of all were the stories of young boys and girls sent to religious institutions not for faith but for hiding scandals. Unwanted pregnancies, incest, or sexual assault cases were buried in silence behind monastery gates. The Middle Ages were more than just battles and plagues. They were a time of obsession with sin, with shame, and with secret pleasure. People lived in a constant tug-of-war between what they were told to do and what they actually desired. And even in the face of brutal punishment, the human spirit found a way to express itself in passion, in rebellion, and in the most shocking acts history tried to erase.
We've already uncovered how the Middle Ages were filled with contradictions, where strict laws and wild desires danced side by side in candlelit secrecy. But now we go deeper, because some of the most shocking acts weren't just hidden, they were celebrated in certain corners of society, and some were so strange, so twisted, they sound almost unbelievable today. Let's talk about magic and sex, two things that went hand in hand in the medieval mind. Sexual magic and love potions. In the medieval world, sex wasn't just about lust. For many, it was deeply tied to magic and power. Across Europe, women, especially herbalists and wise women, were believed to have the ability to control a man's desire. One of the most common tools? The love potion. Made from herbs like mandrake, belladonna, honey, and even animal parts, these potions were mixed into wine, soup, or bread. Some were used to make a man fall in love. Others were used to increase performance or pleasure. And then there were the darker ones, meant to drive someone mad with obsession or to bind a person sexually to another. Some believed that putting a drop of menstrual blood into a man's drink would make him yours forever. Others used a man's hair or semen in spells to keep him from leaving. But these magical practices came with a risk. If caught, a woman could be accused of witchcraft, and sex magic was one of the quickest ways to get burned at the stake, not because it was fake, but because it worked a little too well. Sexual curses. On the other side of magic was the power to curse. There are recorded cases of angry lovers, men or women, visiting local witches to curse an ex. One common curse? Making the victim impotent. Yes, medieval people believed that a man's ability to perform could be taken away through spells. Some men even visited the church begging for exorcisms after believing they were cursed by jealous lovers. It got so serious that church officials had to write full manuals on how to remove sexual curses. One guide described tying a rooster to the man's leg and whispering prayers for 7 nights straight while burning goat fat. But even worse than curses were the rituals used by secret societies, the cults of the flesh. In the hidden parts of Europe, some underground groups took sex to a spiritual level. These weren't just orgies, they were rituals. There are whispers in medieval texts about secret gatherings where men and women believed that having sex at the right time, under the right moon, could bring them closer to God. In southern France, a group known as the Free Spirit movement believed that the soul could only be released through sexual unity. They met in forests, danced naked, and shared partners freely. To outsiders, they were heretics, but to members, it was a sacred experience. Some of these groups were wiped out. Others went underground, but their writings remain, proof that medieval minds were searching for freedom, even in the most forbidden ways. Animal trials and beastly acts. Now, this part of history is both disturbing and unbelievable, but it really happened. In some parts of medieval Europe, animals were put on trial for crimes, including sexual ones. If a man was accused of having relations with a cow, goat, or pig, the animal would also be arrested, given a trial, and sometimes even executed alongside the human. There are actual court records describing pigs being hanged or goats being burned for participating in unholy acts. It sounds absurd today, but it shows just how seriously the medieval world viewed sex, not just as sin, but as something that could taint the entire community. And what's even more chilling? Sometimes the person accused wasn't even guilty. A neighbor's jealousy or a political enemy could spread a rumor, and suddenly someone was facing death over an impossible accusation. Sex and the plague. When the Black Death struck Europe in the 14th century, killing millions, sex took a strange turn. People were terrified. They thought the plague was punishment for sin. But in the face of death, many turned to pleasure as a last escape. There are records of plague orgies, gatherings of people who believed that if they were going to die, they might as well die in ecstasy. In some towns, survivors described entire households collapsing into days of drunkenness, sex, and feasting, waiting for the disease to take them. But the church saw this as further proof of corruption. Priests preached harder, punishments grew crueler, and yet, behind the panic, people were still chasing the same thing: love, touch, closeness. Even in the darkest hours, human desire refused to die. Strange devices and early sex toys. While we often imagine medieval people as clueless about pleasure, some were surprisingly creative. In the port cities of Italy and Spain, craftsmen began creating wooden and leather devices meant to simulate sex. Some were simple, padded tools or shaped objects used by widows and travelers. Others were more complex, with straps and hinges, often hidden inside furniture or storage boxes. Some brothels even rented these devices out like library books. While most of these objects were kept secret, a few survived in museums, and when historians opened up old diaries and legal records, they found more descriptions, proof that sexual imagination was alive and well, even under the weight of religious control. So now you know, the Middle Ages weren't cold, boring, or innocent. They were raw, risky, and full of secrets that history tried to bury. People didn't just survive, they felt, they experimented, they loved and sinned in equal measure. From dark rituals and shameful punishments to desperate passion and strange pleasures, medieval sex was anything but simple. Behind every church wall, every royal banquet, every village barn was a world you were never meant to see. If you found this journey into medieval secrets as fascinating as we did, don't forget to give this video a like, share it with your friends, and drop a comment below. What shocked you the most? What hidden history do you want to uncover next? Subscribe to the channel for more forgotten stories from the past, because history isn't just about dates and wars. Sometimes it's about what people did when no one was supposed to be watching.